No one wanted the broken $2 Apache girl until the lonely cowboy took her in as his own family. The small frontier town lay under the hot, harsh sun, the kind that made dust swirl in the air like tiny ghosts dancing in the heat. Wooden buildings lined the dirt streets, and the occasional horse trotted lazily by, leaving prints in the dry earth. The town had a rhythm of its own, shopkeepers shouting the day's prices, children chasing one another, and cowboys stopping by the saloon for a brief respite from the open plains. But amid this ordinary bustle, one figure went almost unnoticed, and yet her story was the kind that could not be ignored once it came to light. She was a young Apache girl, no older than 9 or 10, with tangled black hair that fell unevenly around her small, dirt-smudged face. Her clothes were torn and patched in places that never quite stayed sewn, and her bare feet carried the calluses of someone who had walked long miles on unforgiving ground. But what struck most people was not her appearance. It was the sadness that seemed to cling to her, a quiet, invisible weight that made even the sun seem harsh when it shone on her face. The townspeople called her the broken girl. It was not out of cruelty exactly, but out of fear. She had been left behind by her own community, a girl who somehow did not fit in, who seemed unlucky or cursed to those who looked at her with suspicion. Rumors had spread like wildfire in the small town. Some said she had been orphaned when a raiding party swept through her village. Others whispered that she had survived a great tragedy, though no one could say exactly what it was. People didn't ask questions. Instead, they turned their faces away and went about their business, unwilling to offer help or kindness. Her days were spent wandering the edges of the town, between the wooden fences and the open prairie. She had learned to be invisible, slipping past the adults who would chase her away with harsh words, hiding behind crates or under the shade of buildings to rest her tired legs. Hunger gnawed at her constantly, and when she found scraps of food tossed aside by careless shopkeepers, she ate quickly, always watching, always listening, ready to flee at a moment's notice. There were nights when she slept under the stars, curling herself around the warmth of a small fire she dared to make, afraid of the wild animals that prowled the dark plains. Despite her hardships, she was clever. She knew how to find water in the small creek that ran behind the outskirts of town, how to catch a rabbit with a makeshift trap, and how to make herself appear smaller and less threatening when adults passed by. She had learned to speak softly, not because she was shy, but because loud voices drew attention, and attention had never been kind to her. Her life had taught her that survival depended on being cautious, on staying in the shadows, on trusting no one but herself. Even so, there were moments when she allowed herself to dream. Sometimes when she watched the sun sink below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, she imagined a life where someone would look at her not with fear or pity, but with love. She imagined a home where she would not have to worry about hunger, where she could sleep without fear of the night, where laughter was not just a distant memory, but a part of everyday life. These dreams were fragile, delicate as spider webs, but they were hers, and she held on to them fiercely, like the only treasure she possessed in a world that had given her so little. One morning, as the town slowly stirred to life, she found herself drawn to the market square. It was a place she had avoided before because of the harsh eyes and sharp tongues that always seemed to find her. But that day, hunger pushed her forward, and she crept along the edges of the stalls, watching the merchants arrange their wares. Bright fabrics fluttered in the wind, the scent of fresh bread filled the air, and coins clinked as deals were made. She lingered near a stall that sold small trinkets and household items, her eyes catching the glimmer of a tiny spoon discarded behind a crate. It was there, among the bustle and noise, that she was spotted. A merchant, A man with a sun-weathered face and a sharp voice barked at her to move along. "Get out of here, girl. You don't belong here." He waved a hand at her, but she didn't move fast enough. He leaned closer, and the words came out with a mixture of irritation and mockery. "What's a worthless thing like you doing here? Someone ought to just sell you and get rid of the trouble." The words hit her like stones, but she kept her face down, her hands clutching the small spoon she had found. She knew she had no choice but to obey, no choice but to leave quietly, hoping no one else had heard. But the damage was done. She could feel the stares of others in the market, curious eyes that wanted to see her fail, to confirm that she truly was as useless as the merchant claimed. By midday, she was weak from hunger and the relentless sun. She wandered toward the outskirts of town, seeking the shade of a cluster of trees near the creek. Her small body trembled, not just from heat, but from the constant anxiety that clung to her. She wondered, as she often did, why the world was so harsh, why kindness seemed reserved for everyone but her. She thought of her family, scattered and gone, and felt the sting of loss more sharply than she had in weeks. The ache in her heart was a constant companion, reminding her that she was alone in a world that seemed determined to reject her. That afternoon, a group of townspeople gathered near the general store, talking in low voices. Some mentioned the girl, others ignored her. But one thing was clear: she had no one. No family to call her own. No friends to stand up for her. No place where she truly belonged. And so they decided on what they thought was a practical solution. They would sell her for a few coins, enough to get rid of the problem and perhaps make a small profit in the process. A passing traveler might take her, or a family might decide they wanted a child without asking questions. She had become, in their eyes, just another commodity to be traded, a girl without value, except what someone was willing to pay. When the deal was made, it was for a mere $2. The price seemed to match her worth in the eyes of those around her. She had no voice in the matter, no way to refuse, and no power to escape. She felt a deep, cold emptiness as the coins were exchanged, a hopelessness that seemed to seep into her very bones. For a moment, she closed her eyes and wished she could vanish entirely, melt into the ground and disappear from a world that had shown her nothing but rejection. Yet even in that darkest moment, a tiny ember of hope remained. Somewhere beyond the town, beyond the narrow streets and dusty buildings, perhaps there was someone who would see her differently. Someone who would not care about the $2 price tag. Someone who might see the girl inside the tattered clothes, the child beneath the fear and sorrow. That thought, fragile as it was, became her silent companion as she walked away from the market, away from the only life she had ever known, into a future unknown. She did not know it yet, but her story was about to change. The days of being overlooked, rejected, and sold were nearing an end. Someone was out there, waiting to find her. Someone who would see her not as a burden or a broken child, but as a person worthy of love, protection, and belonging. But for now she continued on, silent and wary, carrying her small bundle of hope alongside the weight of the world on her shoulders. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the town, she finally reached a small, hidden spot by the creek. She settled down among the rocks and dry grass, her small frame curled tightly for warmth. She stared into the water, watching her reflection ripple and distort, and wondered if anyone would ever see her clearly, if anyone would ever care enough to look beyond the scars and the sorrow. And in that quiet, reflective moment, she made a promise to herself. No matter what happened, no matter how cruel the world might be, she would survive. She would endure, and she would continue to hold on to the smallest spark of hope that someday, somehow, someone would come for her, and her life would be different. The sun had barely risen over the open plains when the cowboy rode into town. He was a quiet man, a figure of calm in the midst of the dusty, bustling streets. His hat was worn and dusty, his coat patched in places from long days on the trail. People in the town knew him, though not well. He didn't stay long in one place, always moving with his horse, working where he was needed, but never settling. He had a reputation as a loner, a man of few words, and many believed he preferred it that way. On that particular morning, he had stopped at the market to buy supplies for his journey ahead. As he walked among the stalls, he noticed a small figure sitting apart from the others, near the edge of the creek that ran behind the town. At first he thought it was a stray dog or a wandering child of another traveler, but as he approached he realized it was a young girl. Her clothes were torn, her hair tangled, and her small face was pale and wary. She clutched a small, dirty bundle in her arms, and her eyes, dark and fearful, looked up only briefly before darting away. The cowboy paused, unsure of what had brought him to notice her. Something about the girl tugged at him, a quiet plea in her eyes that spoke louder than words ever could. He had seen hardship before, had faced loneliness himself, but there was a fragility in this child that made him pause. No one else seemed to care. The merchants were busy with their business, and the townspeople passed by without a glance. But the cowboy could not ignore her. "Hey there, little one," he said softly, careful not to startle her. His voice was calm, steady, and kind, carrying across the soft rustle of the wind through the grass. The girl flinched at first, pulling her bundle closer, her small body shrinking against the weight of fear she carried. She had learned over the years that adults were often dangerous, unpredictable, and unkind. Her first instinct was to run, to disappear into the shadows and hope she would not be followed. But the cowboy did not move closer in a threatening way. He took a seat on a nearby log, keeping a safe distance, letting her know that he meant no harm. "I won't hurt you," he said gently. "I just want to talk for a moment, if that's all right." His words were quiet, patient, filled with a calm that she had almost forgotten existed. Slowly, cautiously, she lifted her eyes to him again, measuring his face, looking for signs of mockery or cruelty. Finding none, she allowed herself to relax slightly, though her body remained tense, ready to flee at any sudden movement. For a long while, neither spoke. The girl watched him with wary curiosity, and he simply observed her, taking in the details of her situation. The dirt on her clothes, the weariness in her posture, the hunger in her eyes. He had seen many people struggle in his life, but there was something about her that felt different. Something that called to a part of him he had long kept guarded. He thought about what it would take to help her, to give her a life that no one in this town seemed willing to offer. Finally, he spoke again. "What's your name?" The question was simple, but it carried weight. She hesitated, her small lips pressed together, and for a moment it seemed as if she would not answer. Names, after all, were dangerous things in her world. They could be sold, traded, or forgotten. But something in his voice, patient and kind, made her feel as though it was safe to speak. "Apache," she whispered finally, the word barely audible, almost swallowed by the wind. She did not offer more. Perhaps she had no family to claim her, or perhaps she had simply given up on being recognized as more than a burden. The cowboy nodded slowly, acknowledging her without judgment. "That's a fine name," he said. "You've been through a lot, haven't you?" The girl did not respond, but the tears in her eyes gave him the answer he needed. He understood pain. He had seen it in many forms, and he knew the weight of loneliness. In that moment, he made a decision that would change both of their lives forever. He would take her with him, away from this town, away from the harsh judgment of people who could not see her worth. He would offer her something she had never known: safety, care, and the chance to be part of a family. It took some convincing. The townspeople tried to argue with him, insisting she was worthless, that she would be a burden, that no child as broken as she could ever be helped. But the cowboy was resolute. He counted out a few coins, not for the girl, but to satisfy the merchants, and led his horse closer. "She's coming with me," he said firmly. "No one has to agree, but she's coming, and that's final." The girl, for the first time in her young life, did not resist. Perhaps she sensed that he truly meant what he said, that he was not like the others who had sold her or shunned her. Perhaps she simply felt relief, though she did not know how to show it. She climbed onto the horse behind him, holding on tightly, her small body pressed close to his back. The cowboy's hand rested lightly on her shoulder, a gesture of protection, a promise that she was safe. As they rode away from the town, the wind whipping through their hair, the girl began to notice things she had never seen before. The plains stretched out endlessly, golden and wide, dotted with wildflowers and low hills. The sun was warm on her face, but not harsh. It felt gentle, like the first touch of kindness she had ever known. She could hear the soft sound of the horse's hooves on the earth, rhythmic and steady, and she began to feel, for the first time in years, that perhaps she was not alone. The cowboy did not speak much on the ride, but his silence was not empty. It was filled with a quiet assurance that she was safe, that she would be cared for, that she belonged. Slowly, she began to relax against him, her small hands unclenching, her body uncurled, and for the first time she allowed herself to hope. Hope was dangerous, yes, but it was also exhilarating. And in that moment, hope felt like a gift, fragile and bright, that she was determined not to let go. When they reached the cowboy's small homestead, it was unlike anything the girl had ever seen. The cabin was simple but sturdy, with smoke curling gently from the chimney and a few animals grazing nearby. There was a garden, small and modest, and a sense of quiet order that made the girl feel, for the first time, that there was a place in the world where she could belong. The cowboy led her inside, showing her the small room he had prepared for her. A simple bed with a clean blanket, a small chest for her few belongings, and a window that looked out over the plains. "Here," he said softly, "this is yours. You can rest now."
"You are safe." The girl nodded, unable to speak.
Words felt unnecessary, and perhaps for the first time she did not need them. She simply allowed herself to sink into the bed, feeling the weight of fear and loneliness begin to lift, replaced by a cautious sense of comfort. Over the next days, the cowboy taught her the small routines of life on the homestead. She learned to feed the animals, to gather water from the well, to light a fire and keep it burning. At first she was slow and hesitant, afraid of making mistakes, afraid that she would somehow disappoint the man who had taken her in. But the cowboy was patient, never scolding, never raising his voice. Instead, he guided her with quiet instructions and gentle encouragement, showing her that mistakes were not failures, only lessons. Slowly, the girl began to trust him. She began to speak in small, careful words, answering his questions and sharing bits of her story. She spoke of the town, of the harsh words and cruel glances, of the nights she had spent alone under the stars, and he listened, never interrupting, never judging. His presence was steady, like a rock in a stormy river, and it made her feel stronger, braver, and more certain that she had found a place where she could finally belong. Days turned into weeks, and the girl's life began to change in ways she had never imagined. She laughed softly as she helped with chores, smiled at the animals she cared for, and even began to sing quietly when no one was listening. The cowboy, who had once been lonely and quiet, found himself smiling more, talking more, and feeling a warmth he had not known in years. Their bond grew, not through grand gestures, but through small, consistent acts of care, patience, and trust. By the time the first signs of autumn appeared on the plains, the girl had transformed in ways that were visible to anyone who knew her story. Her eyes, once filled with fear, now shone with curiosity and life. Her body, once tense and cautious, moved with confidence and purpose, and her heart, once closed and wary, began to understand the meaning of family, not just as blood or tradition, but as a choice, a promise, and a connection built on care, protection, and love. Life on the cowboy's homestead was very different from anything the girl had ever known. For the first time, she had a place to belong, a roof over her head, and someone who cared for her without expecting anything in return. But it was not an easy adjustment. Years of loneliness and hardship had left their mark on her small body and fragile heart. Trust did not come easily, and every new routine, every kind gesture had to be tested before she could believe it was real. The cowboy understood this. He did not rush her. He let her move at her own pace, allowing her to explore the cabin, the garden, and the small barn at her own speed. He showed her how to care for the animals, feeding the chickens, brushing the horse, and making sure the cows had water. Each task was simple, yet it gave her a sense of responsibility she had never felt before. For the first time, she realized that she could be capable of something, that she could contribute and matter. Mornings were her favorite. The sun would rise over the wide plains, painting the sky with colors she had never really noticed before. The cowboy would lead her outside, and together they would tend the animals or gather firewood. He spoke little in the early hours, allowing the sounds of the morning, the birds, the soft neigh of the horse, the rustle of the grass in the wind, to fill the silence. At first, she would stay quiet, unsure of what to say. But slowly she began to mimic him, naming the animals, describing the sights, and eventually even laughing at small jokes he made. She learned that life was not just about surviving. It was about noticing the small joys, the smell of fresh bread baking over the fire, the warmth of sunlight on her face, the gentle touch of an animal she had helped care for. She began to understand that the world could be kind, that not every person would look at her as worthless or unwanted. And each day her trust in the cowboy grew, like a small plant slowly unfurling its leaves toward the sun. The cowboy, for his part, noticed the changes as well. At first, he had taken her in because he could not ignore her suffering, because he believed no child should live alone in fear. But as the days passed, he realized that their lives had become intertwined in ways he had not expected. Her laughter brought warmth to the cabin. Her questions about the animals and the world reminded him of the simple joys he often overlooked. And her presence filled the empty spaces in his heart that had grown hollow from years of solitude. It was not always easy. There were days when the girl would retreat into herself, recalling the harsh words and cruel treatment she had endured in the town. She would sit quietly by the creek, skipping stones over the water, her face solemn, her thoughts heavy. On these days, the cowboy would sit beside her, not speaking, not pushing her to talk, just offering the quiet comfort of company. Sometimes she would lean against him, resting her small head on his shoulder, and in those moments, she would let herself feel safe and cared for, even if only briefly. Meals became another part of their growing routine. The cowboy taught her how to cook simple foods over the fire: porridge in the morning, beans and cornbread for lunch, and stew in the evening. She learned to stir the pot carefully, to measure ingredients, and to taste her work. There were times when she burned the food or added too much salt, and the cowboy would chuckle softly and show her how to fix it. No words of anger, no sharp rebukes, only patience and gentle instruction. Slowly, she began to see that mistakes were not punishments, but lessons, and that learning could be a source of pride rather than fear. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire and talk. At first, the girl spoke little, her words short and cautious, but as the weeks passed, she began to share stories of her past, her village, and the few memories she held dear. She spoke of her family, of moments before tragedy struck, and the cowboy listened without interruption, nodding and asking gentle questions. He did not judge her or pity her. He simply accepted her story as part of who she was, and this acceptance began to heal wounds she had carried for years. The girl also began to learn new skills that would help her on the plains. The cowboy taught her how to ride the horse properly, how to navigate the land, and how to find food and water when needed. Each lesson was accompanied by encouragement and praise. "Good work," he would say. "You're learning fast." At first, she doubted her abilities, expecting failure as always, but slowly she began to believe in herself, discovering strength and courage she had never known existed. One day, as they were mending a fence near the edge of the property, the girl paused and looked at the cowboy. "Why?"
Why did you take me?
she asked quietly, almost afraid to hear the answer. The cowboy paused, wiping the sweat from his brow, and looked at her. "Because no one else did," he said simply. "Because every child deserves a chance, and you're no different. You deserve to be safe and loved." She did not respond immediately. His words were foreign to her, concepts she had only imagined in dreams. But over time, she began to understand. She realized that love could be given freely, without expectation, without judgment, and that trust could grow from patience and kindness. She began to see the cowboy not just as her protector, but as someone who truly cared, someone she could rely on, someone who had become a part of her life in a way she had never thought possible. The seasons began to change, and with them, the girl began to flourish.
As a great towel.
Her hair, once tangled and dull, was brushed and cared for, her clothes mended and clean, her small frame growing stronger with each passing day. She laughed more freely, her eyes sparkled with curiosity, and she even began to explore beyond the homestead under the cowboy's watchful eye. She discovered wildflowers along the creek, birds' nests in the trees, and the beauty of the plains stretching endlessly before her. Each new discovery filled her with wonder and joy, emotions she had not felt since before her life had been upended. The cowboy, too, changed in these months. The loneliness he had carried for so many years began to lift. He found comfort in the girl's presence, purpose in teaching and guiding her, and joy in the small victories of her daily life. Their bond was not built overnight, but through shared experiences, patience, and unwavering care. They became a team, learning from each other, relying on each other, and finding companionship in ways neither had expected. As winter approached, the girl had grown accustomed to the rhythm of life on the homestead. She woke with the sun, worked alongside the cowboy, tended the animals, and learned the skills she would need to thrive. She no longer flinched at the sound of voices or feared the world outside the cabin. Instead, she faced each day with cautious optimism, her heart slowly opening to the possibility that life could be kind and that she could belong somewhere. Evenings became a time for storytelling. The cowboy would share tales of his travels, of adventures on the plains, and lessons learned from life on the frontier. The girl would listen intently, sometimes asking questions, sometimes adding her own thoughts. They laughed together at funny stories, marveled at tales of distant lands, and shared quiet moments of reflection. These times strengthened their bond, helping her understand that family was not just about who you were born to, but who chose to care for you, guide you, and share life with you. Through all of this, the girl began to heal. The pain of rejection and loneliness did not vanish entirely. It would always be a part of her, but it became manageable, softened by love, patience, and the steady presence of the cowboy. She learned that trust could grow slowly, that mistakes did not define her, and that she could face the world with courage and resilience. She discovered that family could be chosen, that bonds could be formed through care and commitment, and that hope, fragile though it may be, could blossom into something real and sustaining. By the end of the first year with the cowboy, the girl had transformed in ways that were visible to everyone who knew her story. Her eyes shone with life and curiosity, her laughter rang freely across the plains, and her small body carried the strength and confidence she had once lacked. And the cowboy, once a solitary figure wandering the open land, found himself enriched by her presence, filled with purpose, and touched by a love that went beyond words. Together they had begun to build a life of trust, hope, and belonging, a life in which the girl was no longer broken, no longer unwanted, but a cherished part of a family that had chosen her. And as the seasons continued to change, their story unfolded, a quiet testament to the power of patience, kindness, and the human heart's ability to heal. Life on the homestead continued to grow in rhythm and comfort, but it was no longer just about survival. The girl had become a part of the cowboy's world, not merely a visitor, but a member of his little family. Every day brought new lessons, small adventures, and opportunities to discover the strength within herself. The cowboy, once a man of solitude, now carried a quiet joy in his heart, a satisfaction that only came from seeing someone thrive under his care. The morning routines had become a shared rhythm. As the first rays of sunlight stretched across the plains, the girl would rise, brushing her hair and helping to light the fire. She had learned to move through the cabin without fear, knowing that she was safe, that her actions mattered, and that she could make a difference. Breakfast was a quiet affair, but they would often share small conversations about the day ahead. "Let's check the west pasture today," the cowboy would say, or "We'll gather firewood from the hill." She listened attentively, learning not only the skills necessary to live on the plains, but also the confidence to speak up, to make choices, and to feel that her opinions were valued. The animals, too, had become her companions. The horse, once distant and wary, now nickered at her approach, recognizing her gentle touch. Chickens and goats came running when they saw her, and even the dog that had been cautious at first now wagged its tail eagerly whenever she appeared. Caring for these animals taught her patience, responsibility, and empathy. Each day she grew stronger, not only in body but in spirit, learning that love and care could create bonds that were stronger than fear or loneliness. The cowboy often took her on walks across the plains, showing her the beauty of the land and the lessons it held. They watched sunsets together, marveling at the way the sky changed from gold to pink to deep purple. He taught her the signs of weather, how to track animals, and how to recognize the plants that were safe to eat. The girl listened closely, absorbing knowledge with a sense of wonder she had never experienced before. She began to realize that the world was not just a place to survive in, it was a place to explore, to learn from, and to enjoy. As they worked together, their bond deepened in ways that could not be measured. The girl began to call the cowboy Papa, a word she had been hesitant to say at first. He accepted it without question, embracing her as his own, and she, in turn, began to feel a sense of belonging she had never known. Their home was filled with small moments of happiness, shared meals, quiet laughter, and the warmth of knowing that someone cared deeply for her well-being. She no longer flinched at sudden movements or sharp words, and she began to trust that kindness was not something to be feared, but to be cherished. Yet life on the plains was not without its challenges. There were days of storms when rain pelted the roof of the cabin and thunder rolled across the sky. There were times when the animals were sick or the crops struggled, and the work seemed endless. On these days, the cowboy and the girl worked side by side, learning resilience together. He taught her that challenges were not punishments, but opportunities to grow stronger, to face difficulties with courage, and to help one another through tough times. The town, once indifferent or cruel, began to notice the change in the girl. Word spread that the lonely cowboy had taken in the child who no one wanted. Some were surprised, others skeptical, but slowly, curiosity turned into admiration. People began to see the girl not as the broken child they had once rejected, but as someone thriving under the care of a kind man. Children who had avoided her now watched with wonder as she rode confidently on horseback, tended to the animals, and helped with chores. Adults who had whispered about her misfortune began to nod with respect when they passed the homestead. The girl, however, did not pay attention to the whispers of the town. Her focus was on the life she was building with the cowboy, the routines they shared, and the lessons she learned every day. She had grown more confident, learning to speak her mind, to express her thoughts and feelings, and to take pride in her accomplishments. She began to understand that family was not defined by blood alone, but by care, trust, and commitment. One afternoon, as they worked in the garden, the girl paused to examine a small flower that had bloomed despite the harsh sun. She held it carefully in her hand and looked at the cowboy. "Papa, do you think it's strong because it never gave up?" she asked quietly. The cowboy smiled, seeing the thoughtfulness in her young eyes. "Yes," he said. "Sometimes the strongest things are the ones that keep going, even when the world seems too hard. And you're just like that flower." The girl felt warmth in her chest, a mixture of pride and love. She realized that she was not just surviving anymore. She was growing, learning, and becoming someone capable of facing the world with courage. She began to see herself differently, no longer the broken child sold for $2, but a young girl with purpose, skills, and the love of someone who would never abandon her. Evenings became a time of reflection and shared stories. The cowboy would tell tales of his youth, of the places he had traveled, and the lessons he had learned along the way. The girl would listen, fascinated by the stories of adventure and courage. Sometimes she would share her own small stories, recounting memories from her early life, the hardships she had faced, and the little victories she had achieved since coming to the homestead. These moments strengthened their bond, teaching her that her voice mattered, her experiences were valid, and that she could be proud of who she was becoming. The seasons passed, and the girl's growth was evident, not just in her skills, but in her spirit. She had learned to ride confidently across the plains, care for the animals, tend the garden, and manage daily chores with skill and efficiency. But more importantly, she had learned to trust, to love, and to believe in the goodness of people. She no longer feared the world. She faced it with curiosity, courage, and a quiet confidence that came from knowing she had a safe place to call home. The cowboy watched her transformation with quiet satisfaction. He saw the strength in her eyes, the independence in her actions, and the joy in her laughter. He knew that taking her in had changed his life as well. He had traded loneliness for companionship, emptiness for love, and a solitary existence for a life filled with purpose and connection. Together, they had created a family not defined by blood but by choice, care, and unwavering support. One crisp morning, as frost glistened on the grass and the first hints of winter approached, The girl helped the cowboy repair a fence along the edge of the property. Her hands were small but strong, her movements confident. As they worked, a neighbor from the town rode by, pausing to watch. He had heard of the girl and was curious to see for himself. When he saw her tending to the animals, guiding the horse, and moving with quiet determination, he nodded in respect. "She's grown into a fine young lady," he said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else. The girl, unaware of the observer, continued her work, focused on the task at hand. She had learned that recognition was not the measure of her worth. Her actions, her skills, and the love she shared with the cowboy were enough. And yet, the acknowledgement from the town, though small, was a sign that the world was beginning to see her not as a burden, but as someone valuable and capable. Through all the challenges, joys, and small victories, one thing remained constant: the bond between the girl and the cowboy. It was a bond built on trust, respect, and unconditional care. They had faced hardships together, learned from one another, and created a home filled with love and warmth. And as the seasons continued to change, the girl grew stronger, wiser, and more confident, knowing that she had found not just a protector, but a family, a place where she belonged, a life she could call her own. By the end of the year, the homestead was no longer just a place of shelter and work. It was a home. The girl had grown in every way, physically, emotionally, and mentally. She had learned the value of hard work, the importance of kindness, and the strength that comes from resilience. Most importantly, she had learned that love, patience, and trust could heal even the deepest wounds. And as she looked across the plains from the porch of the cabin, the wind ruffling her hair and the horse grazing nearby, she realized that she had finally found what she had been searching for all along: a place to belong, someone who loved her unconditionally. Baba died at Dawson Day, and a life filled with hope and possibility. The cowboy standing beside her watched her with pride and quiet joy, knowing that together they had built something lasting, something meaningful, and something beautiful. A family forged not by circumstance, but by choice, care, and the simple power of love. The years passed quietly on the homestead, each one weaving the girl and the cowboy closer together, creating a life built on trust, care, and unwavering love. What had begun as a fragile bond between a lonely man and a frightened child had grown into a family that thrived in the middle of the vast plains. Time had a way of softening old wounds, and for the girl, every day brought new lessons, new victories, and new opportunities to grow. She was no longer the timid, broken child sold for $2 in the town market. She had become a young woman filled with confidence, kindness, and a spirit shaped by resilience and love. The cowboy, too, had changed in profound ways. Once he had been a man who roamed the plains with only his horse for company, speaking little and trusting even less. But the girl had brought life into his world, showing him the value of patience, care, and connection. His heart had softened. Once quiet laughter now filled the cabin and the fields. He found joy not in solitude, but in watching her grow, in seeing the small victories of her everyday life, and in sharing the steady rhythm of work and care that formed the foundation of their family. Their daily life was a blend of work, learning, and discovery. The girl had become skilled in managing the homestead, feeding the animals, tending the crops, mending fences, and preparing meals. She had learned to ride the horse confidently across the plains, to navigate the land with awareness and care, and to respond calmly in moments of challenge, whether a storm was approaching or an animal was sick. Her hands were strong, her mind alert, and her heart filled with compassion not just for the cowboy who had saved her, but for the world around her. Evenings were still their favorite time of day. After the chores were done and the sun began to sink behind the distant hills, they would sit together on the cabin porch. The wind carried the sweet scent of wildflowers from the nearby fields, and the soft sounds of animals settling for the night filled the air. They would talk, sometimes about the past, sometimes about the future, sometimes about the stories of the land and the creatures that lived on it. The girl had learned to tell her own stories, sharing memories from before the cowboy had arrived, recounting adventures on the plains, and expressing dreams she had never dared to voice before. It was during these quiet moments that the depth of their bond was most evident. The cowboy had become more than a guardian. He was a mentor, a teacher, and a father figure in every sense of the word. And the girl, in turn, had grown to trust him completely, seeking his advice, valuing his opinion, and drawing strength from his steady presence. Their relationship was built on respect and love, a mutual understanding that they were stronger together than they could ever be alone. The town, too, had continued to notice the transformation. People who had once whispered about the broken girl now spoke of her with admiration. Children who had avoided her now asked questions, eager to learn from someone who had faced hardship and emerged resilient. Adults nodded in quiet respect when they passed the homestead, acknowledging the girl's courage and the cowboy's unwavering commitment to her well-being. The story of a lonely cowboy and the girl no one wanted had become a quiet legend, a tale that reminded the community of the power of kindness and the importance of family formed through choice rather than circumstance. As the girl grew older, the cowboy encouraged her to take on more responsibility and to pursue her own interests. She learned to tend the garden with care, to repair tools, and to manage the daily rhythm of the homestead with confidence. She also began to explore the surrounding land on her own, always returning with stories of discovery, hidden streams, bird nests, and the tracks of animals that passed through the plains. Each new adventure strengthened her independence, teaching her not only survival skills but also the value of curiosity, observation, and respect for nature. Education became another important part of her life. The cowboy, though unlettered in many ways, understood the importance of knowledge. He helped her learn to read from old books he had collected during his travels, guiding her slowly through each lesson with patience and encouragement. Over time, she learned to write her own thoughts, to read stories aloud, and to explore new ideas. Knowledge, once denied to her in the harsh streets of the town, became a tool for empowerment, opening doors to imagination and understanding she had never known existed. The seasons continued their steady rotation, marking the passage of time in a way that was both gentle and profound. Spring brought new growth to the fields and flowers to the edges of the homestead. Summer carried long days of work under the sun, filled with laughter and the satisfaction of accomplishment. Autumn painted the plains with gold and red, a reminder of the beauty of change. And winter, though harsh and cold, brought quiet reflection, cozy evenings by the fire, and a sense of endurance that came from facing challenges together. Each season reinforced the lessons of resilience, patience, and care that had become the foundation of their life together. There were moments of difficulty, as there always are in life. A sudden illness in one of the animals, a storm that damaged part of the cabin, or an unexpected shortage of supplies could bring worry and hard work. But the girl had learned to face challenges with courage and calm, relying on the lessons taught by the cowboy and the strength she had cultivated over the years. Together, they overcame obstacles, solving problems with patience, skill, and teamwork. Each challenge they faced became another opportunity to strengthen their bond and reinforce the lessons of life, love, and responsibility. Through it all, the girl never forgot her past. She remembered the harsh streets, the lonely nights, and the moments of fear that had shaped her early life. But instead of allowing those memories to define her, she used them as motivation to grow, to care, and to embrace the life she had been given. She had been broken once, yes, but she had been rebuilt with love, patience, and the guiding hand of the cowboy who had seen her value when no one else did. One day, as she sat on the porch watching the sunset, the girl realized how far she had come. She thought of the lonely child who had wandered the streets, sold for $2, and rejected by everyone around her. She smiled softly, knowing that the girl she had been was still a part of her, but that she had grown into someone stronger, wiser, and capable of facing the world with confidence. The cowboy, noticing her thoughtful expression, reached over and gently touched her shoulder. "You've come a long way," he said quietly. "I'm proud of you." Tears of gratitude filled her eyes, but they were not tears of sadness. They were the result of love, pride, and a deep understanding of the journey she had undertaken. She had learned what it meant to trust, to be cared for, and to care in return. She had discovered the power of family formed through choice, the importance of kindness, and the strength that comes from perseverance and hope. And she knew that, no matter what the future held, she would carry these lessons with her always. The homestead, once a quiet and simple place, had become a haven of love and learning. Friends from nearby towns visited, curious about the girl who had grown into such a remarkable young woman. Travelers passing through often paused to share stories or offer help, and the cowboy welcomed them with the same warmth and kindness that he had shown to the girl from the very beginning. Their home had become a place where others could see the results of patience, care, and the choice to embrace someone when the world had turned away. As the years passed, the girl blossomed fully into adulthood. Her skills were refined, her confidence was steady, and her heart was open. She continued to care for the homestead, to nurture the animals, and to support the cowboy in every way she could. But more importantly, she became a symbol of resilience, hope, and the transformative power of love. People who had once doubted her now looked at her with admiration, and children in the town began to see that even those who are rejected can find a place where they belong and thrive. The cowboy, now older, watched with quiet pride as the girl he had saved flourished. Their bond had grown into something unbreakable, forged through years of shared experiences, lessons, and love. He had given her a home, a family, and a life full of possibilities, but in return, she had given him companionship, joy, and the fulfillment of knowing that he had truly made a difference in someone's life. Together, they had created a legacy of care, trust, and unconditional love, proving that family is defined not by blood alone, but by the heart, the choices we make, and the bonds we nurture over time. And so their story became a quiet legend on the plains. The girl who had once been sold for $2, rejected by all around her, had grown into a strong, kind, and capable woman. The lonely cowboy who had taken her in had found the family he had longed for, the connection he had once thought impossible, and the joy that comes from helping another person thrive. Together they had built a life filled with hope, love, and the enduring proof that even in a world that can be cruel, kindness and care can transform the lives of those who have been forgotten. In the end, it was not about the hardships they had faced, the storms they had weathered, or the judgments of others. It was about the choices they had made, to trust, to care, to love, and the life they had created together. The girl had learned that she was never truly broken. She had only needed the right hands and heart to help her heal. And the cowboy had learned that even the loneliest of souls can find purpose, love, and family in the most unexpected ways. As the sun set over the endless plains, casting a warm glow across the homestead, the girl and the cowboy stood together on the porch, side by side. Their eyes met, and without words, they shared the understanding that their journey had been worth every challenge, every tear, and every moment of patience. They had found in each other a family, a home, and a life filled with hope, joy, and the quiet, enduring beauty of love chosen freely. And in that moment, with the wind rustling through the grass and the animals resting peacefully nearby, they knew that they had created something truly special, something that would last not just in their hearts, but in the story that would be told for years to come. A story of a lonely cowboy, a girl no one wanted, and the life they built together through patience, trust, and love.